Welcome to Learning to Mean the Same Thing, Intercultural Pragmatics and Meaning Negotiation. My name is Andy Clark. I'm a PhD candidate at the University at Albany SUNY in the Department of Educational Theory and Practice. This talk examines how teachers and learners negotiate meaning when language does not mean what it appears to. But what is language? According to István Keszkes, language is a system of signs operated by a conceptual base, which is a reflection of the sociocultural background in which the system of signs is put to use. In other words, language isn't just a code that gets transmitted. It's a socially grounded system of meaning-making that reflects the people using it and the experiences they bring with them. It can be visualized as such. Now, in first language communication, the system of signs, the conceptual base, and the sociocultural background align fairly closely. While never perfect, there is a shared baseline that communication can rely on. In intercultural communication, however, that alignment can't be assumed. Speakers may share a linguistic system, but they often operate from different conceptual bases which have been shaped by different sociocultural backgrounds. Now, as can be seen in this situation, the only fully shared resource is the linguistic system. The conceptual base in this communicative situation remains personal and culturally situated for each of the interlocutors. This means that meaning can't be assumed. It has to be negotiated. Now, this is a core assumption in intercultural pragmatics and lingua franca research. Learners do not abandon their existing conceptual systems when they engage in the target language. Instead, they're constantly negotiating between prior knowledge and new linguistic resources. As a result, culture and cognition are not background variables. They're active forces in communication. And this raises some important questions. Which conceptual base does the operating system run on? Whose sociocultural background is being reflected? And who decides where meaning comes from? So, when we think about meaning, we often think of meaning coming from words. A lexical word I like to think of as a container because they hold more than one meaning. And when words that hold more than one meaning are combined into phrases, they create expressions that are context-driven, culturally bound, and cognitively loaded. And at this point, learners can no longer rely on just managing those individual meanings. They have to manage conditions for use as well. And this is where vocabulary instruction alone becomes insufficient, and where interaction and negotiation begin to matter. And nowhere is this more apparent than when we look at language like phrasal verbs. For example, pick up, which is a highly polysemous phrasal verb, which can refer to a number of different meanings, many of which have no literal relationship to the lexical components that it's comprised of. So this creates a problem, because for second language learners, if an expression carries so many potential meanings, how can we easily rely on context alone to disambiguate it? More often than not, salience overrides context. So whatever meaning is the most salient, the one that's most frequent, concrete, or familiar, is often the first interpretation that comes to mind. Now, crucially, what's salient in first language users isn't always salient for second language users. And as a result, intended meaning can be delayed, obscured, or misinterpreted. And that's real common when we deal with formulaic language. Formulaic language are prefabricated chunks of language that are stored and retrieved as singular units rather than generated ad hoc through grammatical use, to which I would add that have little to no relationship in meaning to the lexical components they're comprised of. Now, Keszkes originally conceived of this continuum to show how different types of formulaic language exist and move from low formulaicity to high formulaicity. It begins with grammatical units and moves to fixed semantic units, phrasal verbs, speech formula, situation-bound utterances, and idioms. Now, this continuum illustrates the range of formulaic language and the degree to which these expressions rely on convention, shared experience, and psychological salience within a speech community. On the lower end, we see that they rely heavily on lexical composition and rule-based assembly. These are expressions learners can build from words they already know, ad hoc. But as we move along the continuum, expressions rely increasingly on prior experience, cultural conventions, and stored frames. Here, meaning is less generative and more dependent on shared background knowledge. Processing is heavily L1 influenced, and expressions are retrieved as singular units rather than assembled piece by piece. Now, let's map this into something more concrete. So as we move from the lower end of the continuum to the upper end, we're going to see several systemic changes occur. Meaning will become less semantically transparent, and interpretation becomes increasingly opaque as we move closer to native speaker norms. Okay. Now this visualization captures Keskes's core insight. Prior experience plays an increasingly dominant role in how meaning is assessed and produced. On the lower end of the continuum, we see that L2 users' access typically follows word, rule, meaning pathway. Learners attempt to assemble meaning compositionally from parts they recognize. Well, on the higher end of the continuum, processing becomes experience-driven. Here, L1 default access follows an experience frame meaning pathway. Expressions are retrieved holistically, based on prior encounters rather than lexical analysis. So, importantly, what changes across the continuum isn't meaning itself, but access to meaning. The same expression, pick up, exists across multiple points on this continuum, but it's accessed in fundamentally different ways. Okay? The difference in access is precisely where problems start to arise, where learners rely on analytic, form-driven processing for expressions that require experiential, frame-based access. Interpretation stalls, defaults to literal meanings, and misaligns entirely. So, what do we do? If there are parallel processing pipelines due to the salience effect, then we need to understand that, because even though these L1 and L2 processing are dynamically intertwined, they operate through distinctly different default modes because of salience. Salience, of course, refers to the meaning that is most probable out of all possible meanings, and is therefore the first one accessed. Again, for L1 users, salience supports holistic experience-driven retrieval. Expressions like pick me up are accessed as singular conventionalized units with minimal interpretive effort. But for L2 users, salience often forces analytic form-driven processing. Learners default to word-by-word analysis, and literal meanings are accessed first, even when the expression is intended to be interpreted holistically. So there's a salience mismatch. And it's important to recognize this because it's exactly where interaction begins. When presented with divergence and salience, what can we do to align meaning? Well, learners can't simply switch processing modes on demand. When learners encounter language that relies on experience rather than form, the salience mismatch emerges. And this produces interactional troubles like uncertainty, literal misinterpretation, and delayed intention and access to speaker intention. In these moments, meaning can't be reliably inferred at the individual level. Instead, meaning has to be negotiated socially. And this is where teacher mediation becomes necessary, because it redirects learner processing difficulties by moving from word-to-word analysis towards shared meaning. In practice, teacher mediation is shaped by interaction itself. Through repair, reformulation, prompting, modeling, and alignment checks, mediation works towards coordination, not correction. And this crucially preserves learner agency. It creates a space for learners to test interpretations, express uncertainty, and align meaning collaboratively. It's less about helping learners get it right and more about helping participants mean the same thing in the moment. So if mediation is a mechanism that redirects processing towards shared meaning, the next question is, what does mediation look like? So there are interactional elements associated with mediation. I focused on a small set of them. These interactional elements describe how participants address moments of breakdown and restore shared understanding. Repair refers to the practice used to manage trouble in speaking, hearing, or understanding. Importantly, repair is treated not as error correction, but as a coordination mechanism. Reformulation involves reshaping an utterance while preserving learners' intended meaning. Although it overlaps with recasting, it's treated as a meaning-oriented practice rather than form-focused. Prompting refers to a teacher move that invites learners to reflect on or revise their interpretation rather than receiving immediate explanation. Modeling involves providing contextualized examples of use that learners can appropriate through observation and participation. And finally, alignment or uptake captures learners' observable responses following mediation, such as reuse or reformulation, and is treated here not as evidence of acquisition, but as evidence that participants have achieved momentary alignment and shared understanding. So, with formulaic language continuum and interactional elements of mediation identified, we can move on to the research questions driving this. Because if mediation is a mechanism that restores coordination when salience mismatches occur, well, then what actually happens in classrooms when teachers and learners negotiate meaning? So to address this, I've formulated these 5 research questions. Taken together, they frame formulaic language not as a lexical problem, but as an interactional one. They're deliberately process-oriented. Rather than asking whether learners know particular expressions, they focus on how meaning is negotiated through interaction, how mediation operates across different types of formulaic language, and what kind of alignment follow that negotiation. Formulaic language here is conceptualized as a gradient property, shaped by salience, conventionalization, and contextual dependence. The data that was used for this study consisted of classroom interactions between an ESL teacher and their 2 students, and this allowed for analysis of how meaning negotiation unfolded in real time and how teacher mediation supported that process. My methodology proceeded in 3 stages. First, I identified interactional episodes in which formulaic language co-occurred with observable uncertainty or interactional trouble. Second, these episodes were analyzed qualitatively using an interactional lens, focusing on repair, formulation, prompting, and alignment practice. The goal here was to understand how meaning was negotiated, not whether it was correct. Third, instances were grouped by formulaic type along the continuum to allow for comparison. This made it possible to examine whether different types of formulaic language systematically elicited different types or degrees of negotiation. So, again, I used formulaic language and interactional elements of mediation to test different things. So let's look at each category and see the results. So for grammatical units are interesting because they tend to trigger form-focused uncertainty. And mediation here is typically brief and procedural. Alignment is achieved quickly, because the issue is not meaning in context, but form-function mapping. Okay. Repair and reformulation typically resolve the issue without extended negotiation. Modeling supports correct reuse. But importantly, with grammatical units, learners aren't negotiating a pragmatic meaning so much as clarifying how grammar works, which limits the scope and duration of mediation. And this changes as we move along the continuum to fixed semantic units. Okay. Unlike grammatical units, fixed semantic units are typically retrieved holistically, but they still remain partially transparent in form. As a result, mediation shifts from correcting grammatical form to negotiating meaning, specifically resolving conflicts between literal and conventional interpretations. Teacher mediation here becomes more interpretive and dialogic, involving repair and reformulation to redirect the learner from literal meaning to contextualized meaning. Importantly, alignment here isn't achieved by explaining rules, but recontextualizing use. And this marks a clear shift from grammatical units. Mediation is no longer procedural, but meaning-focused. Phrasal verbs occupy a critical midpoint on the continuum. Though they're formally transparent, learners recognize the individual words, but semantically opaque, because meaning cannot be reliably recovered through composition. Moreover, phrasal verbs are highly polysemous. There are lots of different meanings associated with one phrasal verb. And even with contextual clues available, learners can continually persist in word-by-word analysis. So this makes phrasal verbs a high-friction site for salience mismatches. Mediation, importantly, becomes more layered. Teachers must simultaneously interpret literal parsing, redirect attention, and provide contextualized models of use. Alignment is only achieved once learners abandon word-by-word analysis and treat phrasal verbs as singular semantic units. And this explains why phrasal verbs are such a persistent obstacle for second language learners. Also, why they're some of the richest opportunities for meaning negotiation in classroom interaction. Now, as we move further along the continuum to speech formulas, meaning becomes even more dependent on shared situational knowledge rather than linguistic form. At this point on the continuum, learners struggle not only with the word meaning, but with stance and evaluation to understand what the speaker is communicating about either about the state that they exist in. Literal repair here is no longer sufficient. Mediation must shift toward reformulation and modeling to make the speaker's stance explicit and situationally grounded. Importantly, alignment only occurs when learners recognize that this is tied to an action rather than an action within an event. And this marks a significant qualitative change in meaning negotiation because understanding depends more on shared social knowledge, not on grammatical or lexical analysis. When we reach situation-bound utterances, meaning is no longer recoverable from the expression itself. Here, learners must recognize how the expression is licensed as a temporal event, right? It needs to shift toward reformulation and modeling to explicitly link the utterance to the situational norms and what counts as appropriate or inappropriate in the context. Alignment isn't achieved until learners demonstrate behavioral uptake consistent with the meaning. And this represents a further move along the continuum where meaning is negotiated through social practice rather than linguistic norm. Finally, idioms represent the furthest end of the continuum, where meaning is no longer recoverable from form, context, or institutional cues alone. Mediation, therefore, has to shift towards conceptual reframing rather than clarification. Repair and reformulation are used to dismantle literal mappings, and modeling introduces the idiom in context to establish this figurative sense. At this point in the continuum, meaning negotiation is no longer about language use, but about access to culturally shared metaphorical knowledge. So these different examples taken together show that mediation changes systematically as formulaicity increases. Let's take a look at some of the patterns observed across the continuum. So at the grammatical end, we see that meaning is compositional. It's not situation specific. It doesn't encode stance or metaphor or require much cultural knowledge. It's not retrieved singularly as lexical units. However, we do see that the primary type of mediation is repair and the negotiation length is short. Moving across the continuum to phrasal verbs, meaning isn't compositional any longer. And while context helps, it doesn't always help because there is an emerging encoded metaphor embedded within it. Now, the need for cultural knowledge is medium to high, and this means that more than repair, reformulation and modeling are needed, and negotiation length becomes much longer. And as we move to the furthest end in idiomatic expressions, the meaning is no longer compositional. It's not necessarily situation specific. It encodes a stance and it encodes a strong metaphor. There is a very high requirement for cultural knowledge and the ability to retrieve as singular lexical unit. Okay. Modeling and concept alignment are necessary, and negotiation length is medium to long. So some key findings is that negotiation length increases with phrases embedded with cultural load. The less transparent expressions triggered longer and more explicit mediation. Situation-bound utterances, idioms, metaphors, phrasal verbs were all associated with longer negotiation sequences, often involving explicit cultural explanation. Mediation shifts from procedural repair to interpretive alignment, and teachers move from procedural correction to meaning-focused coordination. Learner uptake follows shared meaning, not isolated explanation. And we saw that reuse and reformulation appeared after joint meaning and common ground was established. Mapping these findings to the research questions, in regard to negotiation processes, meaning is not inferred individually, but it's co-constructed through interaction. And salience mismatches trigger repair, clarification, and alignment work. Regarding the types of formulaic language, well, all categories along the continuum emerged. And the higher the formulaicity, the greater the interactional effort required. Regarding teacher mediation shifts by formula type. Brief reformulation for low-density items and extended mediation for idioms and situation-bound utterances and phrasal verbs. Regarding continuum effects, negotiation intensifies with cultural and pragmatic density, and interactional trouble can be predictable based on formulaicity. And this is important because learner uptake follows shared alignment, not explanation alone. So learners reuse and reformulate expressions after negotiation, not after explanation. So when teachers recognize how different types of formulaic language are processed, they can mediate interaction in ways that support alignment rather than correction. So in this sense, mediation isn't an add-on, it's the mechanism through which implicit meaning becomes accessible. So if we think of formulaic language as just vocabulary, we'll teach more vocabulary. But if we think of it as interactional, we'll design classrooms and lessons that make alignment visible. So this study shows that meaning negotiation is not a peripheral classroom event. It's a central mechanism of language development. Across the formulaic language continuum, breakdowns consistently emerged from salience mismatch, where learners and teachers prioritized different aspects of meaning. These mismatches produced interactional troubles, which were resolved not through correction, but through mediated negotiation. Mediation redirects learners from analytic literal processing toward shared pragmatic meaning. These findings position intercultural pragmatics and the sociocultural cognitive approach as tools for understanding not just what learners say, but how meaning becomes shared. Pedagogically, this reframes mediation as a classroom methodology, one that supports teacher awareness, learner agency, and alignment across languages, cultures, and communicative contexts. In short, learning to mean the same thing is not about knowing more words in a language. It's about learning how meaning is made and negotiated. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you found this presentation informative. If you have any questions, comments, or would like to participate in future projects with me, please reach out at any one of these methods. I'll end this presentation today with my reference slide. Thank you very much. I hope everyone has a wonderful and successful 2026.